tragedy for whites, primarily because this country, the Civil War, I think, was partly fought because there were white men in the North who abhorred the idea of using Negro labor to build the country. Congressman David Wilmot was a great Northern congressman who sponsored the Wilmot Proviso, and that said that white men should be the ones who settle the West, because the issue of the South being kind of the white nationalists on the side of the white people, and the Northerners all being race mixers on the side of the blacks, is really not an accurate dichotomy there. It was far more complex than that, and one of the issues was whether or not the Southern holders of black slaves were going to be allowed to import thousands of blacks into California and Oregon. And a lot of white working men didn't want this to happen, including Congressman David Wilmot. And so basically their attitude towards black enslavement was that it was a curse on America because white men wanted to be separatists. They wanted a separate nation, an all-white nation, and they wanted to do the toil. Now, in fact, they had done the toil because the founding toil of this nation, the great land clearing and swamp clearing, the felling of the trees, was largely done by white pioneers. So that work had been done, but as the financial oligarchy in the South continued to depend on black enslavement, this really troubled the white yeomanry of the United States. So it was a tragedy for both, but I think especially a tragedy for white people. And of course, the most far-sighted of American statesmen founded in 1830 the American Colonization Society for the deportation of blacks back to Africa, and many black people supported this, and in fact, as you know, Pastor Peters, many blacks continue to support that to this day.
Yes, in fact, I had a black speaker at one of my past Christian family Bible camps, Mr. Brock. I don't know if you've heard of him or not.
Yes, I have.
And he's certainly an advocate of it.
Right.
So what you're saying then, Michael, is that virtually every component of what we've come to know as black slavery was first experienced by whites when they were enslaved here in America.
Absolutely. That's absolutely correct. From the fugitive slave law, where whites had a price on their head and were hunted and nearly whipped to death, and in some cases the whippings were actually fatal, to the auctioning of white slaves. As soon as they came off ships, they were taken like cattle, and their arms were felt and their teeth were examined and so forth. And this has been tremendously suppressed. And people can say, well, you know, if this actually happened, why haven't I heard about it? Well, for those of us who are a little bit sophisticated about history, we know that history is rigged and that many historians owe their jobs to how well they play with the party line. But there's also another aspect at work here, and that is the fact that in the late 18th century and throughout the 19th century and even in the early 20th century, because this bondage extends right up into the 20th century, white people were very ashamed if they had a background of servitude. Many of those whites ended up settling in Appalachia. They became very alienated from the mainstream of the United States, and they were ashamed of their background. There was no one to come along and champion their cause here. They saw it as a kind of a stigma. Secondly, the aristocracy that had perpetrated this Holocaust against their own kin realized that they committed a great crime, both in the eyes of sacred scripture and in the eyes of common law. And so it was in their interest to cover this up as much as possible. So it's mostly fallen to me to be the one to dig this back up again and bring it to the attention of all people, black and white, so that we can deal with it and so that other researchers and historians can further explore it, because it's a pioneering field and there's a lot of room here for further discussion and investigation.
Well, where did you start going to find this material? Of course, you've got an excellent bibliography in the back, so I shouldn't ask you that, but why don't you tell the people?
Well, I live here in upstate New York, and believe it or not, New York is not entirely comprised of Manhattan. In fact, we have tried to break off the state. We've tried to make Manhattan the 51st state and make upstate New York, which is largely rural and farms, its own republic. So I'm in a very rural area, and the history here is very rich. Revolutionary War battles were fought, especially the Indian Wars of the American Revolution, with Generals Clinton and Sullivan fighting the Iroquois. And also, I'm quite near to New England. In fact, when I originally became interested in this story, it was by researching Matthew Lyon, who is one of the American Revolutionary War heroes. He was a hero of the Battle of Bennington, Vermont. The famous commander of that, of course, was Ethan Allen. But as I began to dig into Matthew Lyon's story, I discovered that Matthew Lyon was a white slave. He became a very great American politician and a congressman, and in fact, he was imprisoned in a famous sedition case after the Americans won their freedom. He was imprisoned by the Federalists, but he became a great and accomplished man. He wrote a book, and he referred to himself as "by the bulls that redeemed me." Apparently, Matthew Lyon had been sold in return for a couple of deer, a couple of male deer. And, I mean, that was the status of white people in the 18th century in America. And so I couldn't find his grave, and later on I found out that he wasn't buried in New England at all, but he went down much later in his career after his wife died to the Kentucky-Tennessee area, where he made a name for himself in business. I did locate the grave of his wife, but as I discovered this, I was quite shocked that here was a great Revolutionary War hero whose life as a young man, he was an immigrant from Ireland, was worth no more than two male stags. And from there I began digging into diaries and documents and early colonial laws and piecing this together. And I also found that historians in their published works have parts of the story, but they're basically too pusillanimous to refer to it for what it is. There's a real problem among historians. They refuse to refer to whites as slaves. It's almost a phobia on their part. You can trace a great deal of their research leading inevitably, pointing in the direction of the fact that whites were slaves, but for reasons of political correctness, they can't bring themselves to use that word. So the footsteps and the tracks of this great mystery can be ferreted out in a number of areas, both in terms of original research, diaries, and letters, as well as in published histories.
During the Civil War, let me ask you this, or the war between the states as they call it, the northern abolitionists accused the southern whites of being heartless. But the Confederates, they would counter by claiming that the northern whites held white people in virtual slavery in the factories in the north. What can you tell my audience about the enslavement of white factory workers in America, and in Britain for that matter?
Yes, well, Pastor Peters, that's another suppressed story. It was one of the really great challenges of the Southerners against the North and has gone largely unanswered. The factory system, once again, began in Great Britain during the Industrial Revolution, and it itself was a form of enslavement. Now, we might feel to say, well, the popular image of slavery is on a plantation, and we may be willing to grant the idea that whites were enslaved on tobacco plantations, but how can you say whites were enslaved in a factory? Well, it's very easy because the documentary record shows that they were locked into the factory. The doors were locked. These were largely, by the way, children who were workers in the factories that did the very toughest of the work, both in the northern United States as well as in industrial Britain. They worked under the absolutely most horrendous conditions.
What age of children are we talking about?
We're talking from an age, depending on the machinery and the type of work, we're talking from as young as 5 years old on up to 14 or 15. So you had that situation where these northern abolitionists, many of them were factory owners. As we know, Frederick Engels was a factory owner, but he claimed to have a tremendous interest in the welfare of poor whites. This seems to be a